My name is Imogen, and for as long as I can remember, my world smelled of damp earth, rose petals, and history. The story of my family wasn't written in books, it was cultivated in the soil of Blackwood Manor, our ancestral home. But this isn't a story about a happy family heirloom. It's the story of how my family tried to bury that history under a mountain of concrete, and how the one tiny piece of it they left me became the seed of the sweetest revenge I could have ever imagined. Before I dive into how a single rose cutting toppled a real estate empire and rewrote my family's legacy, I'd love to know where you're all watching from today. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever had a passion that someone else dismissed as trivial, go ahead and hit that like button, because I have a feeling you'll understand where I'm coming from. And for all the new faces here, make sure you subscribe, because this channel is a community for people who know that sometimes the things others throw away are the most valuable treasures of all. Blackwood Manor wasn't just a house, it was a living chronicle. The sprawling gardens were its heart, laid out over centuries by generations of my ancestors, each adding their own chapter. There was the stark, geometric precision of the Elizabethan knot garden my great-great-great-grandmother had laid, its boxwood hedges still crisp and green. There was the wild, romantic wonder of the Victorian fernery, tucked into a shady, moss-covered dell. But the crown jewel, the very soul of the place, was the rose garden. It contained specimens from all over the world, but its centerpiece was a single, ancient bush known in our family journals only as the Alara rose. It had been planted 200 years ago by my ancestor, Alara, a botanist ahead of her time. Its blossoms were a color I've never seen since, a deep, velvety crimson that seemed to swallow the light, with edges that faded into a soft, dusky lilac. Legends said it was the last of its kind. My grandmother taught me its secrets, her hands, gnarled with age, but gentle as a butterfly's wings, guiding mine as we pruned and tended. She'd press a fallen petal into my palm and whisper, "This is our memory, Imogen. It remembers everything. The sun, the rain, the hands that cared for it. Never forget that." For me, horticulture wasn't a hobby. It was a language, a connection to the women who had walked these paths before me. I knew the pH of the soil in the rhododendron walk by its scent after a rain. I could tell which wisteria vine needed more iron just by the pale cast of its leaves. The garden was my sanctuary and my university. To my parents, Richard and Eleanor, it was a balance sheet liability. They walked the same paths I did, but they didn't see memory. They saw maintenance costs. They didn't see history. They saw untaxed acreage. They were city people, their hearts beating to the rhythm of stock tickers and quarterly reports. They appreciated the garden the way one appreciates a painting in a museum, a static, valuable object, but ultimately someone else's problem. Their real investment, their living, breathing masterpiece was my older brother, Julian. Julian was brilliant, charismatic, and moved through the world with an effortless confidence that I could only envy. He was going to change the world with his high-risk tech startup, a nebulous venture called Synapse that promised to revolutionize, well, nobody was ever quite sure what. But it involved algorithms and data, and a lot of buzzwords that made my parents' eyes gleam with pride. My love for botany, for the slow, patient work of cultivation, was a source of mild embarrassment to them. It was quaint, a childish hobby. It didn't scale. It couldn't be monetized in a Series B funding round. It was, in their eyes, utterly useless. The end came on a Tuesday in late spring, the kind of day the garden loved most, with a soft sun and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of lilac and damp soil. My parents called a family meeting in the formal dining room, a room we only used for Christmas and bad news. The mahogany table was so polished you could see your worried reflection in it. Julian stood at the head, next to a projector screen, buzzing with an almost manic energy. He clicked through a presentation filled with sleek graphs and upward trending arrows. He spoke of disrupting paradigms and leveraging synergies. I didn't understand most of it, but I understood the number at the end, a staggering amount of capital he needed to get Synapse to the next level. My parents watched him, their faces glowing with an adoration that was almost painful to witness. They were rapt. They looked at him and saw the future. When he finished, my father, Richard, cleared his throat. He didn't look at me. He looked at the far wall, as if addressing a shareholder. "Julian, your mother and I are in complete agreement," he said, his voice firm with manufactured certainty. "We believe in you. We're all in." I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. "All in?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What does that mean?" My mother, Eleanor, finally turned to me, her expression a careful mixture of pity and resolve. "Imogen, darling, we know how much you love this place." "We do. But we have to be practical. Blackwood is a tremendous asset. A dormant asset." Julian stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. It was meant to be comforting, but it felt like a brand. "Amy, think of it. The legacy we could build. A real legacy. Not just old flowers. We're talking about technology that will shape the future." The air left my lungs. "You're selling it," I said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a truth that had just landed and shattered everything. "We have a very generous offer from Apex Urban Development," my father said, all business. "They're planning a luxury condominium complex. Tasteful, of course. State-of-the-art." I stared at him, at all of them, my vision blurring. "The garden?" I stammered. "Grandma's garden. The Alara rose. It's 200 years old. It's our whole story." That's when my mother delivered the line that would echo in my head for years. She sighed, a little puff of exasperation, and patted my hand. "Imogen, you have to grow up sometime. It's a garden. People build new ones every day. It's time to let go of these childish hobbies and face the real world." Childish hobby. The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering and cruel. My entire world, the sum of my knowledge, my passion, my connection to my own history, reduced to a trifle. Julian's vaporware startup was a legacy, but the living, breathing history outside the window was a hobby. I looked at my brother, hoping for an ally, for a flicker of shared memory. He just gave me a small, tight smile. "It's for the best, Amy. We'll all be better off. I promise." In that moment, I saw with perfect, soul-crushing clarity that I was completely and utterly alone. The sale went through with brutal efficiency. Men in hard hats and bright vests began appearing, walking the grounds with measuring tapes and clipboards, their voices loud and jarring in the sacred quiet of the fernery. They were polite, but their presence was a violation. They looked at the ancient Japanese maple my great-grandfather had planted and saw only its timber value. They trampled the wild violets without a second glance. My last week at Blackwood was a blur of grief. I walked the paths from dawn till dusk, trying to memorize every scent, every leaf, every slant of light. I spent hours in the archives, poring over the old family journals, tracing the spidery handwriting of my ancestors, reading about their triumphs and failures in the soil. I found Alara's original entry about her rose, the excitement in her script still palpable across 2 centuries. "I believe this strain is unique," she wrote. "A happy accident of nature. I shall call it Alara's Crimson, in the hope that it outlives me and carries my love for this place forward." It was a knife in my heart. The head gardener, a wonderful old man named Thomas, whose grandfather had been head gardener before him, found me crying by the sundial. He was being let go, of course. The developers had no need for a man who knew how to coax orchids into bloom. He looked at me, his eyes full of a shared sorrow. He didn't say much. He just handed me his own personal pair of Felco pruners, the blades sharpened to a razor's edge. "If you're going to take a memory," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "take a living one." That was all the permission I needed. On my last day, as the moving trucks rumbled down the long gravel drive, I walked to the center of the rose garden. I stood before the Alara rose, its ancient, gnarled canes heavy with deep crimson blossoms. It felt like a desecration, but I knew it was an act of preservation. With trembling hands, I selected a healthy, semi-hardwood stem from the current season's growth. Following the techniques Thomas and my grandmother had taught me, I made a clean, slanted cut just below a leaf node. It was a single cutting no longer than my hand. It was all I took. My only inheritance. I wrapped its base in damp sphagnum moss and sealed it in a small plastic bag. As I walked away from Blackwood Manor for the last time, I didn't look back. I couldn't. In my hand, I clutched the tiny, fragile branch. It was everything. A memory, a legacy, a final act of defiance. A childish hobby. My new life was a jarring contrast to the sprawling green acres of Blackwood. I moved into a tiny, third-floor apartment in a nameless suburb. My garden was now a 6 by 4 foot concrete balcony that overlooked a parking lot. The air smelled of asphalt and exhaust fumes. The despair was a physical weight, a constant ache in my chest. For the first few weeks, I did nothing. I'd sit on my threadbare sofa, staring at the wall, the silence of the apartment deafening after a lifetime filled with the rustle of leaves and birdsong. The cutting sat in a glass of water on my kitchen counter, a sad, green twig that seemed to mock me with its resilience. My family would call, their voices bright and distant, full of news about Julian's new office space or the glowing press he was getting in tech blogs. They'd ask me if I'd found a real job yet. They never asked about the garden. It was as if it had never existed. One morning, I woke up and saw a tiny, almost imperceptible swelling at the base of the cutting. A root nodule. It was the smallest sign of life, but it was enough. Something shifted in me. A tiny spark of the defiance I'd felt on that last day rekindled. They had taken my home, they had dismissed my passion, but they had left me this. And I would not let it die. My tiny balcony became a makeshift laboratory. I spent what little money I had on bags of perlite, vermiculite, and sterile potting mix. I bought a small humidity dome and a heat mat. I researched propagation techniques for antique roses obsessively, cross-referencing modern scientific papers with the notes in Alara's old journals. I learned that older, woodier roses were notoriously difficult to root. The odds were stacked against me. My first attempt was a catastrophic failure. I used a rooting hormone that was too strong, and the base of the cutting turned to black mush within a week. I had to trim it back, losing a precious inch of its length. I cried for an hour, convinced I had killed the last remnant of my family's true legacy. The second attempt also failed. A fungal infection, despite my best efforts at sterilization. The cutting was getting shorter, weaker. I was filled with a frantic, desperate energy. I felt like a doctor in an emergency room, trying to save a life with dwindling supplies. I started talking to it, just as my grandmother had taught me to talk to her orchids. "Come on, Alara," I'd whisper, misting its single, wilting leaf. "You survived 200 years. You can survive this. You have to." I started documenting everything. I kept a logbook, noting the temperature, the humidity, the light exposure. I photographed its progress, or lack thereof, every single day. I was no longer just a gardener. I was a scientist, a historian, an archivist fighting to save the last page of a priceless book. My parents' words, childish hobby, became a perverse mantra. Every time I felt like giving up, I would hear my mother's dismissive tone, see my father's blank stare, and a fresh wave of angry determination would wash over me. This was not a hobby. This was a rescue mission. I realized I needed more than just intuition. I needed data. I took a tiny sliver of one of the trimmed-off leaves and sent it to a university lab for a nutrient analysis, pretending it was from a common garden rose. The report came back with a detailed breakdown of its mineral deficiencies and requirements. It was the key. For my third attempt, I created a custom-blended rooting medium based on the lab results. I used a milder, gel-based rooting hormone. I built a small, automated misting system with a cheap aquarium pump and a timer. My balcony looked like a mad scientist's lair. For weeks, nothing happened. The final leaf shriveled and fell off, leaving a bare, pathetic-looking stick in the pot. I was heartbroken. I thought it was over, but I kept the heat mat on. I kept the mister running. I kept checking on it every morning, my hope dwindling with each passing day. And then one Monday morning I saw it. It was so small, I thought I was imagining it. a tiny speck of vibrant green, pushing its way out of a dormant bud on the side of the stem. A new leaf. I fell to my knees on the cold concrete of the balcony, tears streaming down my face. They weren't tears of sadness this time. They were tears of pure, unadulterated triumph. The Alera rose had chosen to live. The single leaf grew, and then another. A new, tender green shoot began to climb upwards. Over the next year, the pathetic stick transformed into a small, but healthy, potted rosebush. It was still fragile, still needed constant care, but it was alive. I felt a sense of accomplishment so profound it was almost dizzying. I had done it. My skills, the ones my family had so casually disregarded, had saved something priceless from extinction. As the plant grew stronger, I knew I needed to do more than just keep it alive. I needed to verify it. I needed the world to know what it was. I spent weeks composing an email to the most respected historical botanist in the country, Dr. Eris Thorne of the Royal Botanical Society. He was a legend, a man known for his rigorous standards and his almost complete lack of sentimentality. I attached my photos, my logs, and the story of the cutting. I hit send with a trembling finger, fully expecting to be ignored or dismissed as a crackpot. To my astonishment, he replied within a day. His email was short and skeptical. Intriguing, if unverifiable. The Alera rose is considered a botanical myth, Mississippi. A romantic fiction from an old journal. However, the leaf morphology is unusual. I would require a physical sample for DNA sequencing against our archives. I carefully packed a few leaves and a small piece of stem in a climate-controlled package and sent it off. The 2 weeks I waited for the results were the longest of my life. I checked my email 100 times a day. Julian called during that time. He was on top of the world. Synapse had been featured in a major tech magazine. He was being hailed as a visionary. "You wouldn't believe the buzz, Emmy," he said, his voice crackling with self-satisfaction. "We're closing another round of funding." Dad's ecstatic. He said this is what a real legacy looks like. He asked what I was up to. I mumbled something about a gardening project. He laughed. "Still playing in the dirt, huh? Well, someone's got to do it." He didn't mean to be cruel. He was just completely, utterly oblivious. His words, which once would have crushed me, now felt like fuel. "Just wait," I thought. Just you wait. The email from Dr. Thorne arrived at 2 a.m. I saw the subject line, Alera specimen, and my heart hammered against my ribs. I opened it. It was longer this time. "Dear Miss Imogen," it began. "I must confess, I have not been this startled in my 30-year career. My apologies for my initial skepticism. The DNA is a 99.97% match to a pressed specimen we have in our archives, collected in 1825 and attributed to the botanist Alera Blackwood. The sample was thought to be the last on Earth. You have, against all odds, successfully propagated Rosa Alera, a species we all believe to be extinct for over a century. I must insist on seeing the plant in person. This is, without exaggeration, the most significant botanical rediscovery of the decade." I read the email 3 times, the words blurring into a beautiful, triumphant song. I had a name for it now. Rosa Alera. My childish hobby had just rewritten a chapter of botanical history. The rediscovery of Rosa Alera was not a quiet affair. Dr. Thorne, true to his word, flew out to see the plant. He arrived at my tiny apartment, a stern, white-haired man who looked completely out of place next to my IKEA furniture. He examined the rose bush with a reverence that brought tears to my eyes. He touched a leaf with the tip of his finger, as if it were a holy relic. "Incredible," he muttered, over and over. "Absolutely incredible." He co-authored a paper with me for a prestigious botanical journal. The story was picked up by the mainstream press. It was a story people loved. The lost history, the last-minute rescue, the young woman who saved a piece of the past on her tiny apartment balcony. My face was in newspapers. I was interviewed for gardening magazines and even a morning news show. The headlines were dizzying. "The Lost Rose of Blackwood Manor. Amateur horticulturist makes discovery of a lifetime. a 200-year-old miracle in a pot. My family's reaction was muted. My mother called and said, "Oh, we saw you in the paper, dear. That's lovely. Your hair looked nice." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of their catastrophic misjudgment. It was as if I'd won a prize at a local flower show. A quaint little achievement. Julian was even more dismissive. "Great press, Simi," he said over the phone. "Maybe you can get a sponsorship from a fertilizer company or something." "Hey, I gotta run. My new lead developer is starting today. Things are blowing up here." Their inability to grasp the magnitude of what I had done was, in a strange way, liberating. It severed the last thread of my need for their approval. I didn't need them to understand. The world understood. Dr. Thorne understood. I understood. And then, a man named Alistair Finch understood. He was a wealthy philanthropist, a quiet, elderly man known for funding arts and conservation projects. His letter arrived not by email, but by courier, on thick, cream-colored cardstock. He wrote that he had been deeply moved by my story. His own family had lost their ancestral estate after the war, and with it, a library of rare books collected over generations. He said he understood what it meant to see a legacy almost turned to dust. He requested a meeting. We met in a quiet tea room. He was a gentleman of the old school, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He didn't want to see the rose. He wanted to hear its story from me. I told him everything. About my grandmother, about Blackwood Manor, about my parents and Julian, about the developers, about my tiny balcony. I talked for 2 hours, and he listened patiently, his gaze never wavering. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Your parents saw the land, Miss Imogen. The developers saw the real estate. Your brother saw an ATM. But you saw the soul of the place. And you had the skill to save it." He leaned forward, his eyes shining with a sudden intensity. "People like us, we are custodians of memory. And memory needs a home. You have a dream of creating a public botanical garden, do you not? A place where Rosa Alera can live, and where other lost and forgotten plants can find sanctuary." I nodded, my throat tight. "It's a foolish dream. It would take millions." He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I have the millions," he said simply. "You have the passion and the genius. I would be honored to fund your dream. Let's give that rose the home it deserves." The Finch Foundation was established with a singular purpose: to fund the creation of a world-class botanical garden under my direction. The news of the partnership made even bigger waves. Suddenly, I wasn't just the girl who found a lost rose. I was a director, a visionary with a budget that made my head spin. I hired a small team, including, to my great joy, old Thomas, the former head gardener of Blackwood. We started scouting for land. We looked at dozens of properties, but none of them felt right. They didn't have the history, the spirit. My heart still ached for Blackwood. Meanwhile, whispers had started to circulate in the financial world. Julian's startup, Synapse, was in trouble. The disruptive technology had failed to materialize into a viable product. The burn rate was astronomical. Investors were getting nervous. One evening, I was at my parents' house for a strange family dinner. Julian was there, looking pale and stressed. His phone buzzed constantly. He finally exploded at my father, who had asked a simple question about revenue. "I don't have revenue. You don't get it. This is about growth. Market penetration." Later, I overheard him on the phone in the hallway, his voice a desperate, hushed whisper. "Another bridge loan, just 3 more months. I promise, the prototype is almost ready." I looked at my parents. The glowing adoration was gone, replaced by a deep, anxious worry. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or resentment. I just felt a distant sort of pity. They had bet on the wrong horse, and they were about to lose everything. The news broke a few months later. It was a small article in the business section, but for me, it was a seismic event. Apex Urban Development halts luxury condo project amidst financial crisis. The article detailed how the company had overleveraged itself on several ambitious projects, including one at a historic estate known as Blackwood Manor. A downturn in the luxury real estate market had left them teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The project was dead. The land was in limbo, a liability they were desperate to offload. I read the article, and a slow, cold calm washed over me. I picked up the phone and called Alistair Finch. "I've found the perfect piece of land for our garden," I said. The negotiation was a masterpiece of quiet, calculated power. We didn't go in with a lowball offer. Mr. Finch's lawyers, a team of sharks in bespoke suits, approached Apex Urban Development with a fair market value offer that was, for the struggling company, a lifeline. The lead developer, a slick, condescending man named Mr. Thorne whom I'd met briefly during the sale, was now humbled and desperate. He had no idea who the ultimate buyer was. The entire transaction was being handled through a blind trust set up by the Finch Foundation. I sat in on the final negotiation meetings, a silent observer in the corner of a vast, glass-walled boardroom. Mr. Thorne didn't even recognize me. To him, I was just some junior assistant. He paced the room, sweating through his expensive shirt, haggling over minor clauses, completely unaware that he was negotiating with the ghost of the very history he had tried to bulldoze. He was so focused on the numbers, on the lifeline being thrown to him, that he failed to see the beautiful, poetic justice of it all. The deal was set to be signed on a Friday afternoon. My family found out through a stray comment from a cousin who worked in the city planning office. "Did you hear? Some big foundation bought the old Blackwood property. They're going to turn it into a public park or something." The news sent them into a frenzy. My father, smelling an opportunity, immediately began trying to contact the foundation, hoping to get a consulting gig or somehow attach the family name to the new project. My mother was already dreaming of hosting charity galas on the lawn. Julian, whose company had officially folded a week prior, saw it as a potential new venture to manage. They had no idea it was me. They decided to show up at the law firm on the day of the signing. I think they imagined they could charm their way in, introduce themselves as the original owners, and assert some kind of moral claim on the proceedings. I was sitting at the massive mahogany table next to Alistair Finch and our legal team when the door to the conference room burst open. My parents and Julian stood there, dressed in their best clothes, faces arranged in expressions of pleasant, authoritative inquiry. They froze when they saw me. My father's jaw literally dropped. My mother's hand flew to her chest. Julian just stared, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. "Imogen," my father stammered. "What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, my mother's mind, ever the opportunist, had already recalibrated. A brilliant, relieved smile spread across her face. "Oh, this is wonderful. You're involved. We're getting our house back. I knew you wouldn't let it go." Julian recovered next, a flicker of his old, slick confidence returning. He strode into the room, beaming. "Immy, you should have told us. This is fantastic. We can help. I've got experience in project management. We can make this a family enterprise again. The Blackwood legacy reborn." They were all talking at once, a babble of excitement and plans, completely rewriting history in real time. They saw this not as my triumph, but as their salvation. A way to get back what they had so carelessly thrown away. Alistair Finch looked at me, his expression calm and unreadable. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was my stage. I stood up slowly. The room fell silent. I looked at my father, my mother, my brother. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel the need for revenge. I just felt a profound, quiet clarity. "You seem to be under a misapprehension," I said, my voice even and calm. It didn't tremble. It didn't break. It was as solid as the 200-year-old oak trees they had planned to cut down. "You are not getting your house back. You sold your house. You sold this land. You sold the gardens, the history, and everything it represented." I looked directly at Julian. "This is not a family enterprise. It is a project of the Finch Foundation, which I have the honor of directing." I then turned to my parents. "The funding for this purchase and for the creation of the botanical garden that will be built here comes from the work I did. It comes from the rediscovery of Rosa Alera." I let that hang in the air for a moment. I took a small breath and delivered the final, quiet blow. It comes from my childish hobby. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavier than stone. The color drained from their faces. My mother's smile vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. My father looked as if I had physically struck him. Julian just stared, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. They finally saw it. They saw the scale of what they had lost, not in monetary terms, but in some far more fundamental way. They had not just underestimated me. They had failed to see me at all. They had thrown away a diamond because they thought it was a common stone, and now they were watching as it was being set in a crown. Mr. Thorne, the developer, watched this family drama unfold, his face a picture of confusion, until a flicker of recognition crossed his features as he finally, truly, looked at me. The realization of who he had sold the property back to seemed to douse the last of his bluster. He sank into a chair, looking utterly defeated. Alastair Finch's lead lawyer cleared his throat gently. "If you are not parties to this transaction," he said, his voice polite but firm, "I must ask you to leave. We have documents to sign." No one moved for a second. Then my father, looking suddenly old and frail, turned and walked out of the room without a word. My mother followed, her shoulders slumped. Julian was the last to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at me, his face a complex mess of regret, envy, and something else I couldn't quite name. Then he too was gone. I sat back down, picked up the pen, and signed my name on the deed that made Blackwood Manor mine. The immediate aftermath was as quiet as the confrontation had been loud. My family retreated into a shell of shocked silence. They didn't call. They didn't text. It was as if a chasm had opened up between us, and they were on the other side, looking across at a person they no longer knew or understood. I didn't feel triumphant, not in a fist-pumping, celebratory way. I felt a deep, grounding sense of peace. The first thing I did was walk the land. It was scarred. The developers had already cleared a section near the front gate, bulldozing the wildflower meadow to create a flat, muddy plain for their sales pavilion. The tracks of heavy machinery crisscrossed the ancient lawns. But the heart of it, the main gardens, the woods, the dell, were largely untouched. As I stood on the great lawn, looking at the house, I felt a connection that was deeper than ownership. It was stewardship. This land wasn't just mine. I was its. I was the next chapter in its long story. The work began almost immediately. The official announcement of the Alara Botanical Gardens at Blackwood Manor was met with enormous public enthusiasm and media attention. Alastair Finch and I held a press conference on the lawn, and I laid out my vision, a place dedicated to the preservation of rare and endangered plants, a center for botanical education, and a beautiful, tranquil space for the public to enjoy. I made a point to honor the past, naming different sections of the garden after the ancestors who had first created them. Thomas, my wonderful, loyal head gardener, was in his element, directing teams of landscapers and horticulturists with a joy that made him seem 20 years younger. We started the slow, careful work of healing the land, reseeding the meadow with native wildflowers and turning the scarred patch of mud into a beautiful new visitor center designed to blend seamlessly with the landscape. About 3 months into the restoration, my parents appeared at the gate. They were hesitant, almost timid. They had brought a flask of tea and some sandwiches, a painfully awkward gesture of peace. They walked with me through the grounds as I explained the plans. My mother kept offering unsolicited advice about color schemes for the tea room. My father kept pointing out things that needed fixing. It was their way of trying to reclaim a piece of it, to feel relevant again. I was polite but distant. I treated them with the same professional courtesy I would show any interested member of the public. "Thank you for the suggestion, Mother, but our design team has a very specific vision." "Yes, Father, we're aware of that drainage issue. It's being addressed next week." They didn't know how to handle this new Imogen, this calm, confident woman who didn't need their approval. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. They were visitors in my world now, and we all knew it. Julian sent a letter. It was typed, formal, and stilted. It was a page and a half of corporate speak apology, full of phrases like misalignment of values and regret for the negative outcomes. It was an apology written by a man who had just failed a business, not by a brother who had broken his sister's heart. I read it, folded it, and put it in a drawer. It was a start, but it was not absolution. True reconciliation would require a language he had yet to learn. 5 years passed. The Alara Botanical Gardens became a world-renowned institution. The single rose I had nurtured on my balcony now had its own dedicated conservatory, where hundreds of its descendants bloomed in velvety, crimson lilac splendor. The gardens were thriving, a vibrant tapestry of history and horticultural innovation. We had breeding programs for endangered orchids, a seed bank for heritage plants, and educational workshops that were booked months in advance. The place was alive, not just with plants, but with people. School children on field trips, their faces full of wonder. Elderly couples walking hand in hand down the same paths my grandmother had walked with me. Artists sketching the water lilies, students studying in the shade of the ancient cedar. The garden was no longer a private treasure. It was a gift to the world. On the 5th anniversary of our public opening, we held a special evening event for our members. I was giving a speech near the sundial, in the heart of the original rose garden. The crowd was a sea of happy, supportive faces. Alistair Finch, now frail but with eyes as bright as ever, sat in the front row. As I spoke, I scanned the audience, and I saw them. My parents and Julian. They were standing near the back, by the old wisteria arbor. They hadn't used a special family invitation. I knew because my assistant had checked the guest list. They had bought tickets online just like everyone else. They weren't trying to get my attention. They were just watching, listening. My mother had tears in her eyes. My father had an expression of profound, complicated sorrow. Julian looked quiet, humbled. He was watching me with an intensity that held no trace of his former arrogance. In that moment, I realized the revenge was complete. Not because I had triumphed over them, but because their opinion no longer mattered. My success wasn't defined by their regret. My worth wasn't a reflection of their judgment. I had built my world, my legacy, out of the very thing they had discarded. I had taken their dismissal and used it as compost, nurturing a seed of defiance into a forest of success. I found my validation not in a family meeting in a stuffy dining room, but here, in the rustle of leaves, in the scent of damp earth, and in the faces of the thousands of people who found peace and beauty in this place. The greatest irony was that in trying to force me to accept their version of the real world, they had propelled me into creating a world of my own, one more real and beautiful than they could have ever imagined. They had sold the land, but I had inherited its soul. So that's my story. It's a story about loss, but it's also a story about growth. It taught me that your value isn't determined by the people who refuse to see it. Sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. It gives you the space to grow in the dark, to put down roots, and to prepare to bloom in the most unexpected ways. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever turned a childish hobby or a dismissed passion into a source of strength or success? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the places others overlook. Remember, family isn't just about the blood you share. It's about the people who see you, who nurture your growth, and who celebrate your blooms. Thank you so much for joining me today. I wish you all the strength to cultivate your own gardens, whatever and wherever they may be.